All right, we are recording. Good to see you again, Annie. We
Good to
are
see you too.
here to talk about a pretty heavy topic today.
A heavy topic, but
Yeah,
hopefully a interesting conversation about death, I would say, but also a, a well-needed conversation about death. I don't think that people really talk about death a lot when we as Indigenous people have kind of dealt with death a lot of in our lives. The more I speak with people who are not Indigenous, I do realize that their ideas of death, kind of the scarce being scared about death, everything that comes with dying is a little bit scary. So we're hoping that this idea of thanatology, which I had learned, oh man, a while ago, it was one of the first podcasts that I actually remember listening to like 3 or 4 times when I heard it. It was on ologies, um, which is a really well-known podcast. And so if you want to listen to that one, I do recommend it. But it really got me thinking. And ever since then, I have been very vocal and very open with death.
yeah, death. Although it is a pretty heavy topic, it's also a really important one. And like you said, a lot of people have a really negative perspective on it, and it doesn't have to be that way. And that's a part of what I really enjoyed and why I thought it was a really good topic for us to discuss. Was there is a lighter side to it, and
Mhm.
the way I see it is most of life is spent getting ready for death, and it's not this sinister end, but more like a transition. And we
Mhm.
all have our own experiences with it. And something I didn't know before I moved to New York is that some people never really had to deal with death of very close people in their lives at all,
Mhm.
whereas I grew up with it.
Mhm.
Since I can remember just being around death, whether it was someone really close in my family or we were helping out at the longhouse or something like that. So
Mhm.
it's been a very big part of my life as long as I can remember. And yeah, it's always been one of those things that seemed to be really heavy and very sad, where people sometimes took months or years or maybe never would get over it. And
Mhm.
I just, it got to the point where I didn't like to be at funerals anymore. And I kind of still don't. But at the same time, it's really important because to be there for your family and to be able to let go of those people. It's really hard to do that alone.
And one thing that I do like about thanatology is that while it's a really deep, kind of dark subject, it also really highlights the importance of your life, living a good life, um, understanding that death is the end all, but there is good that can lead up to that. And I think one thing that we're going to touch on is not only thanatology, but also life education and lots of other things that all revolve around this idea of life with death left in. And I wanted to call it that. I heard there's a couple definitions for thanatology, but to me, life with death left in, I think really touches on what we hope listeners get out of this episode.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a cliche, but it's fairly well known that it's just as much a part of life as birth is. And it really seems like a bit of a tragedy that people are so afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk about all sorts of things, and maybe we won't get to everything, but also that our knowledge of death, how we as a species perceive it, may have been a big part of our evolution even. And I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but the idea of religion very well could have arisen out of this knowledge that we someday will die. Not just that death is a thing, but as an individual, you know that your time here is limited.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of your own mortality is such a powerful thing and could have potentially been one of the huge leaps in our evolution, which is fascinating to me, especially thinking that Neanderthals were aware of their own end, and that they may have been the first among our ancient ancestors to have been burying and having ceremonies associated with death. To me, that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And I think religion does play a big part into death, as it was really in the 1950s when this idea of thanatology came around. And one of the ideas that they think that it came around was because more and more people were stepping away from religion and becoming more atheist. And what does that play into the role of death if you don't have religion by your side? And I think that kind of changed a lot of it. I know me myself, I've kind of thought a lot about what religious identity I identify as. And it's such a weird idea. I call it the religion of myself because I like to pick and choose lots of other religions. I think it's to be in one spot thinking there's only one religion um, is also a misconception. I think you can also tie in a lot of other religions, which we're going to talk about Taiwan and kind of how they're looking at death education in schools, where they've have Buddhists tied into their education programs. So I think it makes a lot of sense now to talk about death as more and more people are changing identities or trying to find where spirituality, religion, or atheism plays into their being.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember at one point feeling or thinking I was an atheist, but then I realized, oh, that's when you believe that there's nothing. And that's
Yeah.
never how I felt. It was always more like, there's something, but I have no idea what it is. And I found out, oh, that's agnostic. And so there's all these terms that you can use to describe what you believe. From my
Mm-hmm.
experience, though, the way people act, what you do, and what you choose to do with your life says a lot more about what you believe than what you say, or even what you
Mm-hmm.
think. So that's the way I try to act, or I try to act as if though there is something more than death, that it is more of a transition,
Mm-hmm.
and that I need to get ready for that. That means living a good life. And that's pretty hard. I think that's why it's so important.
The older I get, the better I want my life to be, the better person I want to become, the better aunt, the better daughter, the better friend. Being an introvert, it is kind of tough sometimes, and I've been really trying to step and push outside my boundaries and be more vocal and be more present in people's lives and really live a good, content life, which is a lot harder than just even the word content. Um, is a really tough idea, and I think it all changed when I was very vocal and open with my parents, me closer to
So you,
living that content life that
I
I know
really
that
don't
I
want to
want.
interrupt you, but you just the internet on your end cut out a bit.
Oh,
So can you,
can
if you just,
is it better now?
yeah, it's good.
What was the last thing you heard?
So you were talking about how you've been really open and vocal with your parents, and then it cut
Oh,
out a
yeah.
bit.
Well, just open with my parents, and I think that led for me to be a lot more positive about my life. I think I was one of those people that was scared about death. I dealt with it a lot, and you kind of get in this rhythm of like, this is all that's happening, this is all that I can do. And now I'm really trying to focus on a good, healthy, positive life. And
Mm.
that means talking about death, dealing with death in a lot of different capacities. We're going to talk about comparative thanatology, which talks about how animals deal with death. Now that I deal with a lot with wildlife, I deal a lot with animal deaths too. And we had this one cow who, when my parents was here, was having a lot of issues. She had a lot of hoof issues. And my mom, when we said we'll probably have to put the cow down, um, for us, it's normal in wildlife management. But for other
Mhm.
people, even thinking about animal death is hard for them. The cycle of life, understanding predator and prey, and how that all plays into like a really healthy ecosystem. So you see it a lot, not even with just humans.
Yeah, and it's our perception of it that
Hmm.
seems to be the biggest factor in how we act on it and how we feel about it. And perception is powerful, but it is something we do have power over. We can change our perception, we can change how we decide to think about things. And I know emotions are really tough to deal with, but even that,
Hmm.
we as individuals are the only people that do have power over emotions to, and although they are natural reactions, you can choose what you do with that reaction,
Hmm.
especially once you become more aware of it. And it's, yeah, it's really hard to to deal with those things, but again, that's why it's so important. Nothing in life that's worthwhile is easy.
Hmm.
And even though it might be easy in the moment to just be sad or to be mad or and then just wallow in those feelings, over long periods of time it gets harder and harder to live, to want to live, to want to have a good life, if
Hmm.
if that negative is too present and you dwell on it too much. And it's a choice that we make in our daily habits, how we choose to eat, how we choose to sleep, how we choose to live, really has everything to do with how we die. So in a way we choose how we die, but it
Hmm.
happens our entire, like, it's weird, but I really do believe that that's what life is for. It's this gigantic journey that prepares us for death. Kind of like D and like it's a D&D game or Dungeons and Dragons game. And you got your character sheet and you got to build your skills and get your abilities and all this different stuff, and you gather it in yourself on and and by choosing to act certain ways every single day, and by choosing to think certain ways and to engage in certain activities, all of that plays a role on your character sheet. And at the end
Hmm.
of your life you get to cash in your character sheet, and depending on how you lived, you're going to die in one way or another. But that is the thing, I think, partially why it's so tough to deal with, is it's the one thing that is for certain that we all have to deal with.
Hmm.
But at the end, your dying is up to you, because nobody can do it for you, and nobody can do it with you. Even if you die
Hmm.
together, you're the one that's dying. And that can be dark, but at the same time, like I said, depending on how you live your life, it doesn't have to be dark. It could be full of
Hmm.
love and full of even comfort and understanding. And that's why I love this topic so much, especially the death education side of it, as well as even just thanatology itself. The study of death and dying really helps shed light on ways to die a good death. And that's also
Hmm.
something we'll get into as well.
Yeah,
What
I
is,
mean, I think, what is a good death?
yeah.
Well, I think that just brings up what we should probably first talk about is, where does thanatology come from? Can you take a guess? You probably know, but I'm gonna test you because it's been a while since we've talked about at least that part.
Yeah, well, I know that it arose post World War II, even though it had been a topic of conversation for over a century. And it
Hmm.
makes sense that it arose out of World War II, which is the bloodiest conflict in human history. Horrible things that nobody could even imagine
Hmm.
and that's the thing, at a scale nobody knew was even possible. And I still struggle to wrap my head around how many people died during the World War II. It's crazy. But it makes sense how things like thanatology would arise as an official field of study
Hmm.
coming from that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is death education and like grief counseling, really understanding how to cope with death became a big deal after World War II. Again, just losing that mass amount of people, there is a lot of grief and there is a lot of, how do you move forward? And thanatology then became more popular. Again, it has been in many communities and religions and indigenous people long before the 1950s, but that's when it really became more mainstream per Western education. That's when it really started to pick up. And I just really like how the name Thanatology comes from the Greek god Thanatos, which is death. But for him, his death was a peaceful death. And I think that's what we're talking about, having a good death is actually making sure that that death becomes peaceful for you. There was another one where it kind of came forward with the why am I blanking on it? The dying with dignity movement, which is Dr. Kevorkian. I still remember his name. And he was the one that was really pushing for assisted suicide with terminally ill people. And making sure that you're choosing how to die became really important, especially when you do have less than a year to live. It should be up to you how you want to spend that last time and if you're ready to die. So that played a huge part into it as well. And Oregon was the first state to pass that assisted suicide with terminally ill people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can see how it'd be difficult to deal with that legally and ethically, and it's one of those things that needs to be talked about. And I remember he's almost, I guess now it'd be called a meme, but it was one of those things that was so memeable back in when I was a kid. Pretty much everyone knew who Dr. Kevorkian was.
Yep.
But not really. They knew the name and they associated it with a doctor, but not everybody knew what, like, the context of it. And that is one of there's 11 core themes of a good death, and this comes out of the death positive movement, and that is one of them is dignity. And I can see that, and it makes me wonder, and also it makes a lot of sense why so many warrior cultures considered the good death dying in battle, because definitely dignified and it's something you're choosing, you're dying the way you want to die, not just random chance or a random sickness or not being able to move and things like that, but choosing your own death. And that reminds me a lot of the, I think it's more of a pop culture thing where the Norse that would in Valhalla, and how to die a good death, you have to die in battle, and then you end up in Valhalla. But it's such a trippy mythology in the story of why Valhalla exists, and that it's a preparation for the end times, for Ragnarok, and that they all come out of their houses during Ragnarok, and then they get that last battle. It's pretty gnarly, but again, it makes me wonder how that arose, and definitely makes sense, especially in those days when death was pretty common. To be able to choose your own death definitely seems a lot nobler and a lot better than just dying from a bear attack and you get wounded and you die over a 2-week period or something.
Oh my gosh, when you talk about bear attack, I just always think about Leonardo DiCaprio in The Revenant.
Oh
and
man,
that brutal scene. Oh my gosh. I could not do what he did. But talking about Thor in Ragnarok, one of the things that I find very entertaining is that when I talk to people about Thanatology, one of the first things they talk about is Thanos from Avengers.
Yeah, that's what came to my mind when you said Thanatology. I think I even asked that. Does that have anything to do with Thanos? That guy seems like he likes death.
Which, I mean, he does. He takes half of all life on that planet.
And it's like the whole universe. That's the crazy part. It's life across the whole universe. As far as, am I understanding that right? It's half of all life in the universe, not just Earth.
Well, I think that's why he has to conquer every planet. I think it's the planet only, because that's I'm
gonna have to rewatch that. I thought I understood that differently. That's why he had that thing, that glove, and then he could snap his fingers, and then boom, across the whole universe, half of all life. And it's not particular, but half of all life, and it's random. That's why poor old Peter Parker disintegrated into dust. He's a good guy, seemed like. He didn't seem like he deserved to die necessarily, and he's all sad. What did he say? Mr. Stark, or
Mr.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't want
I don't want to die.
to. That's so dark.
It is so dark. That's a dark episode. So probably, I mean, Thanos.
I bet that's where
It's
they got the name. Whoever wrote that story, the DC. No, no, that's not DC.
Marvel.
That's right. Whoever's writing those, I'm pretty sure that's where they got that name.
They've had
Unless
a
there was another
yeah.
another god named Thanos that I don't know about.
Well, there is, so Thanos does have two sisters, or sorry, not Thanos. Thanatos
Yeah.
has two sisters, and it's completely different. So he was known for really peaceful deaths, but his sisters were known for the like horrific deaths. And
Hmm.
so was it, I didn't write it down, but
Interesting. So,
yeah.
that reminds me of what I was saying earlier about how death came to be for at least for
Mm,
Piccani creation
mhm.
stories. It wasn't. It wasn't. It's not that fun of a story, but interestingly enough, kind of similar. It was
It's
a
the women.
woman. Yeah, a woman. Fascinating.
Yeah. It is. It's kind of interesting how stories are passed down. What is it about? But women do tend to
Hmm.
play a quite a big part in, well, in Greek side, at least for the sisters. I think it was like famine and like something. They had some really intense deaths that they dealt with. Yet Thanatos, yeah, very peaceful. It said that hold on, I want to make sure that I read this right. Um, that he would be with mortals in their final hour with a gentle touch akin to that of Hypnos, which is his brother, which is sleep, to end their life. So very peaceful, sleepy death.
Hmm.
Whereas poor sisters. Yeah, I think they were the war and famine.
Dang. Yeah, and that reminds me of there's that theme, especially in Western culture, that women represent chaos and men represent order.
Mm,
Yet at the same time, it's having too much of either is bad.
yeah.
Like too much order, you get Nazis. Too much chaos, you get like Russian communism. Like the crazy shit that we hear about from the
Hmm.
Soviet Union and how many millions of people perished that way. So too much chaos is horrible, too much order is horrible. That's why
Hmm.
there's got to be both working together for this balance. And that's the way I believe why the way not just I believe, but the way I've been taught that's why it was in the long run a good thing, even though painful and sad, especially when it first came about. Eventually it was a good thing because it brought about the natural balance that we see today, where the you live and then you die, making way for new life.
Hmm.
And that's, although it does get us to have to face our own mortality, it's a good thing for all life.
Hmm. Well, and I do think that we have gone through COVID for 3 years now, almost 3 years at this point.
Yeah.
And we have had death kind of thrown at us for the last 3 years. And I know that it has taken a huge toll on my mental health, making sure that I'm worrying for my dad and my mom. I'm making sure that I'm staying healthy. I have a lot of visitors that come in, making sure my staff is safe. It was constant stress
Yeah.
to now where it's just like, how now that we understand that a plague of this magnitude can happen. We've heard about the Spanish flu, you've heard about the plague, the bubonic plague, all of these things that we haven't lived personally. Now that we have, I think it is important for us to understand death in a very, very different way that will help us with these mental stressors that we've had this last 3 years with COVID.
Yeah. And it's, oh man, it's so hard to imagine what those other ones were like because they were so much worse.
Mm-hmm.
So just by the numbers, thinking, just trying to imagine half of everyone.
The bubonic plague would be
That is just nuts.
it is nuts. And the fact that they would put an X on your door, like that was it. I am a paranormal person, and one of the things from left from the bubonic plague is the catacombs.
Hmm.
And just to think of like just the space that they had to put people,
Yeah, stacking them
stacking
up.
them.
That's
Yeah,
crazy.
it it
I mean,
was
I say it's crazy because it's
terrifying.
crazy to me because
Yeah.
I can barely even conceive of what that had to have been like. And half is
Hmm.
actually a little conservative. Some of these cities experience 3/4 of their population to 80%
Hmm.
all dead within a few days, man. That's just so.
And there was multiple times the bubonic
And
plague came back. Like it's crazy to think about. And now that we've had one in the modern era, and
yeah,
I know this isn't
I'm glad it wasn't
been long.
worse because
Yeah.
that's hard to imagine it being worse.
I don't know what I would have done if it was worse. This has played a lot into my mental health, into other people's mental health. I can't get yelled at anymore about masks. I just
Yeah.
can't. I can't do it. I'm so fed up. Wear your glasses to the top. I just How do we then move forward in a positive light? And I think life education is really good role, and also death education.
Hmm. Yeah. And life education, death education, that they almost sound like they're going to be separate things, but really they're the same. Like I was saying
Mm-hmm.
before, and this is just my opinion, the only way to have a good death is to live a good life.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not necessarily subjective either. Having good health, meaning eat
Mm-hmm.
well, make sure you're getting good sleep, make sure you have good social relationships. And if you don't, fix them.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that relationship's over, you can still have some kind of a resolution.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's other aspects to it, but definitely living a good life makes it at least more doable to have a good death.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go through these 11 pillars really quick,
Oh yeah, that'd be
and then
good.
we can and then I'd like to circle back on this thing you meant, the comparative thanatology.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I'm always down to talk about that. I fell down that rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. So there's 11 core themes of a good death, and then there's the top three. So the 11 core themes are the what your preferences for a specific dying process, pain-free status, and then number three is a religious slash spirituality, and the fourth core theme is emotional well-being, and another core theme is life completion, and then treatment preference, and then dignity, and then family, and quality of life, and relationship with healthcare provider. And the
Mm.
11th one is kind of not really a core theme because it's just other, whatever you come up
What
with.
other?
Yeah. And then
Which
other.
I mean,
And it's
that's
like
kind of
makes
good.
sense because you could always be missing something. You never know
Yeah.
what you don't know. But at the same time, that's kind of silly to me. But there's
Other.
top three. The top three are preferences for a dying process. That's number one. And that's what we were talking about before with the warrior cultures wanting to choose how you die. It
Hmm.
makes sense that that's number one. Number
Oh
two
yeah.
is pain-free status, to be
Hmm.
able to have it as painless of a death as possible, which again
Hmm.
makes sense. And then the third one, which is not religiosity or spirituality, but emotional well-being.
Hmm.
That was the third. So these are the top three that were gathered from polling, and this all comes out of the death positive movement, of which a Caitlin Doty is a huge proponent of. And I got this from a interesting podcast you turned me on to. But we'll have all the resources, and we'll put all that stuff in the show notes for anybody we bring up during this
Hmm.
podcast.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
podcast is while we're still here. And I started listening to that when we were rethinking about Thanatology, rethinking about starting the podcast again after we took a little break. I was able to drive to Butte, listen to a lot of it. They're short episodes. I think 30 minutes generally is the long side of their episodes. And it's just really good, quick segments that will get you thinking about death differently, get you thinking about
Yeah.
life differently. And I think sometimes we get so much in these own rhythms of what we know. I don't want to learn anymore. But I think there's something important about being lifelong learners. And I think starting off with your own life and your own death is a great way to kind of kickstart learning something new about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many aspects to it. It does come down to small things, it seems like,
Mm-hmm.
that add together. And one of them is gratitude. That's one of those buzzwords that people say, oh, just be grateful. But
Mm-hmm.
really, it does make a huge difference, especially for the small things.
Mm-hmm.
Like one thing I heard a while ago is never take any interaction for granted. And
Mm-hmm.
I really love that, because you really don't know who you're talking to and who that person could be 20, 30 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and in this podcast, she has a whole episode on it about celebrate every smile. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what she's getting at there, is finding small things to really be grateful for, and not just as a practice and just as a list, but to really truly look for these things in your life and to
Mm-hmm.
seek them out. And that would be one of those things at the end of your life, you look to those things, what you're really grateful for having experienced and what you've
Mm-hmm.
gotten, and the small steps in your journey. That's
Mm-hmm.
definitely beneficial. I can see that in my own life. And but let's circle around to this, the comparative thanatology. This is really interesting to me, that they're just, well, I'm going to leave that to you. What is comparative thanatology?
um Couple again, similar things. I think people have different definitions. The one that I like the most, so again, this is my opinion of which definition I liked, is the study of how different animals react to death.
Hmm.
I was everybody, I think, in the Pacific Northwest remembers when that orca mother lost her calf and stayed with that calf for weeks. I can't remember from the top of my head, but I just remember seeing and witnessing how that mother was clearly mourning for her calf that she lost. And it got me thinking about other animals. And I know that elephants are kind of the same way.
Hmm.
There are plenty of stories that show elephants in particular recognizing the scent of bones that are left in institutes in Africa. There is a really interesting story about in Kenya where this matriarch died of natural causes, was older. They had to take her jawbone back to the research camp to help determine the age at which when she died. And a few days after her bones were brought to the base camp, her family unit walked past, and there were several dozen elephant elephant jaws on the ground within that camp. But what was so special is that the family detoured right to that matriarch's jaw. They knew which jaw it was. After they had all spent some time with the jaw,
That's trippy.
it's super trippy when you like really start to hear these stories. And what broke my heart was that the rest of the family left except for one stayed for quite a bit longer. And this elephant was stroking the jaw with his trunk. He was turning it. He spent a lot of time with it. And then come to find out that was her 7-year-old son.
Oh, dang.
And just to see how these animals mourn, I think it's crazy for us I know that what we talked about earlier about humans understanding death probably plays a big role into Homo sapiens. It's what defines us as Homo sapiens, having funerals and burials, adornments with ceremonies that comes with death. I think animals have a big part in that too.
Yeah, I bet us, and even us observing other animals' behavior
Mm-hmm,
probably affected our evolutionary history. And I bet you even elephant evolution,
mm-hmm.
why they're so smart. Maybe it was the how they started to become aware of their own deaths. And I don't really know much about elephants, but maybe they are aware of their own deaths, and maybe they're not. Maybe they just know in their gut, in their bones, that that was
Mm-hmm.
their matriarch. But that's trippy to me because I don't, this is kind of a little dark, I guess, but if I don't know if I would recognize my mom's jawbone if I were to
I
come across it among other jawbones.
I don't think I could. It
That's,
would,
yeah, that's what's really tripped me out. Like, what they, that's, I wonder if maybe it's a smell thing.
which I, being a person who loves smells, who thinks memories and smells are firmly tied together, I could smell my mom and recognize that that's my mom. I laugh all the time. She had a like a birthmark or like a wart or something on her arm, and I used to rub it and it used to put me to sleep. And now it's removed now, but I still am tempted every time to rub that same spot, and
Hmm.
I recognize her smell, but I don't think I could if it was just her bones, if there was no
Yeah.
clothing, if there was nothing to keep it on. And it just, I don't know what they think. Lots of people have differing opinions of if animals can actually recognize death, if they understand the motion of it, if they know what it means. I just know that some of them have to have that emotional connection where they understand like what's happening. And some people believe that it's like the originish of animals when they die. So sometimes you'll see like monkeys or apes, elephants moving the dead animal to try to see if it will wake up.
Hmm.
So are they looking for that rigidity? There's quite a bit of different ideas. Certain chemicals are released from corpses. I know eusocial insects like bees, they can smell when bees, ants, and wasps can smell when an animal has died because they will remove it from the hive.
Dang. And just from a practical standpoint, that makes sense to
Yeah.
avoid any diseases transferring to the rest of the population. And yeah, and what was it? Not empathy, but I'll think of it in a minute. Social animals seem to be the ones that really truly show any signs of
Mm-hmm.
being aware of death and dying, and that it's
Mm-hmm.
a thing maybe they have to go through. And we're always cautioned, don't anthropomorphize animals.
Yep.
And so,
Which you
and
still shouldn't.
I agree. I totally agree. It makes perfect sense. It does seem to be, though, that the more we study animals and their behavior, the more traits we find that we do in them as
Mm-hmm.
well. Tool use, the awareness of death, or do it. So do the, this is my next question. Do the elephants bury each other?
Um,
Because that seems to be the big thing, that we do something about the death, the dead bodies, and that ceremonial aspect to it. I'd be really curious to find out if they did,
I don't think that they bury them.
if
I
they have a
do.
ceremony or something, mourning period.
I think that they, like other social animals you've mentioned, I think will be around the dead animal for a while. And there was another quote from Joyce Poole, who was an elephant researcher in Mozambique. And what she wrote was that it's their silence that is most unsettling. The only sound is the slow blowing of air out of their trunks as they investigate their dead companion. It's as if even the birds have stopped singing. So to me, it does sound like they have a mourning period of some capacity, whether
Mm,
it's, again, kind of looking for that smell of death, or are they feeling for being rigid? They are doing something to understand what is happening with this dead companion family member that they have there.
yeah. And that also sounds very much like her own feelings versus
Oh
any
yeah,
kind of objective
which
analysis
is
of what's going on. And to be able to get that, you'd have to strap up the elephants in their brains and look at
mm-hmm,
what their brain activity is looking like, maybe their hormone levels, what the
mm-hmm.
hormones are doing could give us some insight into that. And
Oh
so
yeah.
that'd be its a whole nother, that we could do a whole podcast on elephants and how they deal with death and other things, because elephants do seem to be very complex social
Oh
creatures.
yeah. Elephants, orcas, non-primate humans. That's such a weird thing to say. Apes,
Yeah,
monkeys,
it is kind of interesting.
gorillas,
Non-primate.
um, humans.
Wait a minute, is
Um,
that a thing?
yeah,
Non-primate
that's
humans?
what they call them, is non-primate humans.
That's
So
that's weird.
apes are some
Yeah.
of our closer relatives. Ants, I would love to know more about ant death. So if, again, we're just kind of touching the surface of a huge subject. If there's anything that you as a listener would love us to delve deeper into, please let us know. I would be more than interested in delving way deeper into any of these ideas that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and there's a lot of associated fields in within thanatology. Things like
Yes.
there's like physical or biological thanatology there, and that'd be things like a coroner or a mortician, someone that would show up to maybe a crime scene and pronounce somebody
Mm-hmm.
dead, medical examiners. And then there's
Ooh.
also the pastoral thanatology, which is priests and pastors that would go and give
Mm-hmm.
people their last rites. And then there's music thanatology, which is the one that got me thinking about how I would want to die. And
Mm.
a lot of that is associated with harps or some kind of a very peaceful or a comforting environment. And then there's a social thanatology. So there's a lot of different areas of study that go into this, and a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
fields that are associated with the study of death and dying. And then
Mm-hmm.
this, but the life education aspect of it is where the initial definition that you gave, which is
Yeah.
death with life left in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we really wanted to take this podcast, is looking at the educational side of it, and that it's not just about the study of death, but how do we deal with it, and does it have to be dark and negative? I don't think so.
I don't think so. And honestly, the more that I catch myself talking about death and funerals, and I feel like I have a better understanding of it. Um, but it's also very scary, because if I thought like this when I was younger, it would have scared the crap out of me. So how do we incorporate death education with younger people so they
Mm.
understand how to live a good life, and what does a good life mean for somebody who is now facing high school, middle school, a very changing world than we had when we were even in middle school and high school, and making sure that death education is appropriate for every age group. Are we just going to say sorry about the break? I have,
I
now
could
that
do it.
we're trying to do live episodes. So if you see me step away, it's to use the bathroom. So we're slowly figuring out how to get our breaks in. But I know before the break, we were talking about how death education should be available to all age groups, and finding out the best ways to go about that, especially when we are in a community that does tend to have a lot of death with younger generations. How can we help younger generations as well as older generations help comprehend death, and then also having a good death and having a good life for that death?
Yeah, and what age, so you say all ages, what age do we start talking about it? Because I know depending on how you present it and the words you use, it'd be pretty hard for a real young kid to even understand what you're trying to talk about. Is there an age
Yeah.
appropriate, like, is there a minimum age that you've come across as far as the death education movement?
I haven't really seen when you should be talking to them, but I had two grandmas that died when I was 3. I
Wow, you
I
remember that?
I don't. I have no recollection
Yeah,
about that death, their funeral, anything about them really. I don't know when the
yeah.
good time is. I just know that you do deal with death when you're younger.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make it harder to understand death? Or as younger individuals who are changing worldviews, I mean, I definitely don't have the same outlook of life as I did when I was a freshman in high school or an eighth grader. I have completely changed who I am 15 years ish later.
Yeah, totally. I don't know if any, it'd be kind of weird if you stayed the same over that, especially
Yeah.
because the 20s is, I mean, everyone's different, but it definitely seems like 20s is a huge time of change,
I would say
especially
so.
growing up and becoming more well-rounded in your
Hmm.
perspective on life. Whereas as a teenager, yeah, there's a lot of changes, but a lot of it's really confusing. Whereas in this is just my experience. I got a lot more clarity about life and about where I wanted to go, and really came to at a more rational level accept the fact that I'm going to die. I don't know
Hmm.
if I really accepted that when I was a teenager.
I just, so we teach kids about love
Mhm.
and bad things and good things. I think that as they get older, the perception of death education changes. I think being like very broad when it comes to somebody dying, and again, this kind of plays into very much your individual or your community. How do you as an individual go about with death? Is there certain procedures that happens in your community? Is there certain things that happen? Can you just
Mm.
briefly describe what's happening? I think sometimes we're even so scared to talk to death about kids that they're not even allowed to participate in any capacity. But is that in is that going to do more harm to them in as they start to grow up and develop understandings about what death is, or shielding them until they are older to understand the full concept of it? What is the better structure for it? I think everybody's probably going to have a different opinion on when they should start teaching it. Maybe it's different because we deal with death a lot younger in our communities. I don't know. I just know that my mom has talked with me about being predisposed to being an alcoholic, her mother dying when she was 54, both of my grandparents dying when they were grandmas dying when they were fairly young. That I have always known about death. Granted, I wish that it would have been different education that I was getting from it and not so much of like a fear-based one, but more of like an understanding. And one of the kind of conceptual bases that I found while doing some research on death education is that it's supposed to help individuals appreciate that a lifespan is limited and an opportunity to acquire a mature awareness of mortality and to understand that life must be preserved and protected. And I wish that that would have been taught to me at younger, like protecting myself, protecting life, how valuable life is, understanding my lifespan. That I think I was talking to a friend about how we look at the summer being so short, but to somebody who's 5 or 6, that summer seems significantly longer, but they've also had a 5-year lifespan to where that summer makes up a huge portion of their whole life, where our summers,
Yeah.
in hindsight being 30, 32 now, it feels a lot smaller and less, but that's still the same amount of time, just a whole different perspective of it.
Yeah, that's right. That seems to be the thing that changes most throughout our lives is
Mm-hmm.
our perception more than any factual thing or objective reality is the perception of what is objective,
Mm-hmm.
some of that can be taught, things like the inevitability of death
Mm-hmm.
or the irreversibility of it, the non-functionality and the causality of it.
Mm-hmm.
And those things could be maybe pillars that we rely on for teaching these to young people. And I just kind of laugh to myself when I think about sitting next to a 5-year-old and looking him in the eye and being like, you know, you're gonna die, right? This is like seems so messed up.
It does. I wouldn't let's not do that. Let's not recommend
Maybe
that.
not like that.
But I think given the right timing, the right purpose of why you're telling and explaining, I think we should give little kids a lot more credit than normal. I think we kind of assume their intelligence, which isn't right. I think we're putting them on a pedestal
Yeah,
when we should
totally.
allow them to kind of explain more ideas. I have a dang niece who wants to do drones and she's 11. I think allowing kids to have the capacity to grow without our own limitations of how we feel at what level they should be at. They may not understand it and they may ask you a lot of why questions. I know that this tends to be a touchy subject, especially with like the birds and the bees. But I think death itself, if you're in that situation where you have to explain it to a child, I would do it, but that's just me. I don't have kids, so I can't say anything about it. I just know that if I was younger, I would have wanted my parents to explain death to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just because you don't have kids doesn't mean you can't talk about it, especially thinking about how you would prefer to talk about it should you have kids.
Mm-hmm.
Your opinion's valuable. You just don't have the experience that a parent would about talking about these things with kids on a day-to-day basis. And so I have children and I talk to them about it pretty young. And it's a very cultural, very cultural, culturally driven thing at what age you decide to talk to someone about anything, whether it
Mm-hmm.
be sex, birth, death, dying, violence, and the nature of life in general. Yeah, it's gonna come down to what you choose to be the best approach for your kids and your family, because
Mm-hmm.
not all kids are the same. Maybe some kids can handle it younger, other kids not so much. Again, that's why we have to talk about it. And that's one of the things I really got a lot about the death education, especially just more thanatology driven things like how do you talk about death? How do you talk
Mm-hmm.
about dying? Who should you talk about it? Who do you talk about it with? And especially with these things like a do not resuscitate type of thing. That's
Yep.
something I haven't really talked about with my family, but who knows? Maybe I get in a horrible car wreck and I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be, that's something that, yeah, you got to have those conversations and that is going to lead to a better death should that happen, especially when you don't want it to or when it's unexpected,
Mm-hmm.
to have those questions answered so that your family isn't fighting about it while you're on a respirator and totally unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what, we have to talk about these things. At what
Mm-hmm.
age, that's going to come down to the parent and what they think is right for that individual child. I do think they can handle a lot younger than most people might give them credit for, especially if you're
Mm-hmm.
not associating it with them necessarily, but just introduce it in small ways, like a dead insect. Or, I
Yep.
mean, kids always see death in some way or another, and
Mm-hmm.
especially now in movies, it's so omnipresent. Almost
Mm-hmm.
every single movie, especially a lot of these superhero movies, there's a lot of death going on, and they just brush past it like it's no big deal. Like the whole city's destroyed and people are getting
Right.
crushed, and then the next scene they're like, "But what do we do about Thanos?"
Yeah.
it's it's kind of crazy.
I do think that movies, media uh, does play a huge part in death education. Whether it's like what you're talking about, is it this really flawed idea of what death is? Are we just like oblivious to all of the people that have probably died in those movies if we were to like really count it out?
Yeah.
Um,
Hundreds of people, maybe thousands of
right?
people in one scene. It's pretty nuts. That's why I love this, that this is a thing to begin with, that there is actually a study of death and
Mhm.
dying, and that it's very relatively formalized, and that people are taking it pretty seriously now.
Oh yeah, and I mean, talking about DNRs, I have been very vocal with my parents, my sister. Uh well, and especially now that I have a retirement, I have savings. One of the questions that they ask you is, who receives your money when you die, when you're filling out all of this paperwork.
Yeah.
And I think it is important that once you're at that position of your life where you have to start thinking about it, it's better to think about it when you're younger. Um, I'm more savvy on who's getting what money. I've really thought about the future that I'm going to leave behind, which I do think is tough for people. Is while you can prepare yourself for death, I think preparing for your own death versus having somebody close to you die and dealing with that grief and coping is extremely hard. And sometimes moving past that seems impossible. There are
Yeah.
factors that play a huge part into it. And I think there's two parts of death education. It's the coping of the grief of losing somebody, as well as it is the coping and understanding about your own death.
You're 100% correct. And those are the conversations, and even a young person in their 20s, they should at least be aware of that stuff,
Mhm.
because you never really know when your time is done here. And you
Mm-mm.
may not be able to prepare for it. You may not have those days as it approaches, to be able to bring your family together and sort these things out.
Mhm.
And getting into this podcast and really reading more about thanatology definitely got me to wonder more, but specifically to want to talk about it with my
Mhm.
mother, with my kids, and to let them know exactly what I want. So that way there's no mystery, there's no fighting when it happens. Because again, like we said earlier, it is going to happen. It's going to happen to everybody. Why
Mhm.
ignore it? Why put it off? Because it's just going to make it harder when it does happen.
There is this comment about how funerals are for the living.
Hmm.
And I think that's where the biggest disagreement of me and the people that I've told about how I want to be buried, my funeral, is that sometimes there is kind of this push to get what they would like for your funeral. So me being um I've pushed far away from being Catholic, and so to me being in a church seems very inappropriate. But for my mom and for my parents, who that's what they want to happen to them, is they want to go to the Catholic church, they want to have a church service, they want to do all of that, they want to have the rosary. And sometimes my mom, in a joking way, will say like, "Oh, we'll just put you at the church, you're never going to know." And it's like, yeah, true, I'm
Yeah.
not going to know. That's right. I guess in hindsight, there you could do whatever you want to do, but it's still important for you to make sure that people know, because sometimes if I didn't have that conversation with my mom, she wouldn't have never known about how uncomfortable I am right now with my own spirituality, changing who I am spiritually. And it's like I said, it's opened up our conversations to be a lot deeper, and it's I feel have like strengthened my relationship with her since when I was in high school. Ooh, we had a hard relationship. And so now being in a place where I really feel like we're moms, but friends as well, I think is very special. And I do credit that to a lot of me being more open about my life and my death.
Hmm. Yeah, and in a way, it helps bring you a lot closer together when you do talk about these really difficult,
Hmm.
real subjects. Like, what are you gonna do with me when I'm dead?
Hmm.
And that's kind of silly, that, but it's true. Maybe it's not. Maybe we get to go to our own funeral. Nobody knows,
I
and that's
know.
a part of why it's. I think that's a part of why it's scary for a lot of people, is just the unknown.
Hmm.
and and a huge reason why it's an unknown is the loss of religion among many modern people, the separation of religion from everyday life.
Hmm.
Maybe it was a good thing as far as govern, like, so giving government to the people, having people govern themselves, not having a super powerful church institution being able to control that in any way. There's a lot of good that seems to have come out of the separation of church from the state, but it doesn't seem to have caused any good as far as individuals or communities becoming more secular.
Hmm.
It doesn't seem, not from my perspective anyway, the loss of these ceremonies and traditions that typically throughout history have been a source of comfort and relief, especially for people when they're dying, or for
Hmm.
families when they have to let go of a loved one that did die. That's a huge part of what made it bearable throughout human history, is we had these mechanisms, these cultural protocols to follow when someone does die. And
Hmm.
that seems to be one of the huge missing factors in modern life, is these cultural slash religious ceremonies and protocols that have been present for all of human history. So reconsidering those things, where you come from, what is your culture, what kind of society you're part of, all of those, they're still there, and
Yeah.
we need to return to some of that stuff. I'm not saying we got to make church a big part of your life, but there's value in these practices. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist in every single culture that's ever existed. And that's true. There's a quote that I heard, that religion is literally false, but metaphorically true.
Mhm.
And that although literally false, it provided a sense of relief, or it provided enough to for it to be advantageous to us in our fitness and our ability to survive over long periods and generations. Otherwise, it wouldn't have stuck around. That's just the natural selection, why it exists, not in just every culture, but how everybody has this yearning, not necessarily for any particular religion, but to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And so going back to those
Mhm.
things, remembering our roots and finding those cultural protocols will be a huge part of this death positive movement, finding the positivity in it again, not necessarily down one religious path, but somewhere. And I don't see any other huge institution that's filling that role.
And I do think that we're in an interesting time because we have so much opportunity to learn about other cultures with the internet, social media accounts. I think there is more of an opportunity now to find a community that you want,
Hmm.
to find similar minded people, to be like me, where I picked and chose certain aspects of spirituality and religions and kind of made it my own. The internet, while I have never been a huge fan of social media, now I'm kind of stepping away more and more. It does bring a lot of good and bad. There's pros and cons that come with it. But one of the pros is really learning new cultures, learning new places, seeing how different people live their daily lives. I think is very interesting. But I do think it is important that we get back to some sort of connection. Have you ever thought about what is going to run through your mind? Like if you know that you're going to die, like say we'll do a hypothetical situation. If
I'm down.
you have been okay, we were talking about Peter Parker earlier. If you were um Uncle Ben and you just got shot, what is going to be running through your mind right then?
Call the ambulance. I don't want to die. I probably wouldn't have anything super deep like Uncle Ben. Maybe I'd say the opposite. With great responsibility comes great power, nephew. Remember that.
Just get everything wrong.
just say the opposite of everything he said. That's true though. I mean, with great responsibility does come great power. The more responsibility, the more meaning you can have. But that's a different subject.
I mean, but meaning is
I've definitely thought about it. Yeah, I would try to impart some important meaning to my, not necessarily to my death, but more about my life. And if someone was there having to experience my death, I would try to help them handle it.
If there's somebody there, I'm definitely being reassuring. I'm reassuring that person that I'm with.
I wouldn't want them to be sad.
No, I wouldn't either.
Or fearful. And especially not heartbroken. That's the last thing I want from somebody that I really deeply care about. I don't want them to feel sad and heartbroken when I'm dying or when I'm dead. And I would encourage them to live their best life. And don't remember how I died. Maybe you can. Maybe it'd be cool. Like, especially if it was some epic, like, boom, I get hit in the head by an asteroid or something. But I guess then I wouldn't have a nice grand speech. There would be no time. My head would explode or something. So that's another thing, is you don't really get to choose your death necessarily. But let's going back to the hypothetical. Okay, got to stay.
Yeah, hypothetical. Okay, so now what
Uncle
if
Ben situation? Yeah,
Uncle Ben.
That's what I would do. I would try to help them let go.
Okay,
for just to make it simple. Yeah.
Now, what if there is nobody and it's just you? And you got shot, or I hypothetically, the way I want to die is, have you seen 2022, that movie? Wait, 2020,
2012?
2012.
Yeah, where the super volcano blows up.
And that guy is just chilling there in his van in Yellowstone when it erupts.
No, does he? He gets out and he's like, whoa!
Yeah. He's just like, yeah. He's just sitting there enjoying it. What is running through your mind if it's just you? What's going through? What's happening?
So am I at the edge of the Yellowstone caldera? Or am I in a city, or just in my house?
However you imagine yourself wanting to die.
But alone.
The key word is alone.
Yeah. I would probably pray that my family is going to be okay, no matter what, even if they die, that they'll be okay. And if they live, to live a good life. If they die, to die a good death. I would focus on that, and love, strength, those kinds of words that would be going through my head. This is, in the odd way, kind of coming from my own experience with having to deal with really intense suffering and pain. And that's what got me through it. Even just focusing on those words every step. Love, strength, love, strength, love, strength. Over and over and over for minutes or hours. Really focusing on those things, and focusing on your family and everyone that's there for you, or maybe not there, but they're existing and they're a part of your existence. And focusing on that, I think, is what I would do, is do my best to focus on the people I love, and love, strength, because I don't want to die like, oh, poor me. I would love to. If I didn't have family, I would probably be like that guy. Yeah, come on, let's do this.
I always laugh. I'd probably be in the same boat. I would definitely think for my family. I would also be praying to as many gods as I could remember. I would just check them all off as I go.
Come on, Zeus, we got this.
Just praying to them all, hoping
Thanatos, make it peaceful, bro.
Yeah. I mean, because I the thing that I have appreciated about this Thanatology episode is kind of learning more about different cultures and how they deal with death, and
Hmm.
thinking about Greek gods. And then so really going back into time when you had no internet, no lights, you were dying at an earlier age. Death was probably terrifying. And I don't know. Greek gods, Greek history though is just fascinating to me. But just thinking
Yeah.
about in those times, and I've been always contemplating about going back to Greece and seeing the Parthenons and going back with that culture. It was their stories are crazy. And just to think that
Yeah,
if
they are.
any of that was true, I would love to see that. So I'm gonna pray to him. I'm gonna pray to all those. I'm gonna have
So
Thanatos.
that's your religion,
There you go.
Greek myth.
Greek
Because
myths.
now I bet a lot of Greeks are probably Orthodox Christians. Is that right?
I think so. Kind of
So,
like yeah, Serbia, like that whole area, Orthodox.
excuse me. I bet you there, even now, especially now with the internet, there might be a return to some of those ancient beliefs, I bet, among more Greeks than there had been
Mhm.
previously over the last few centuries. Because now that the internet's here, we can
Oh
believe
yeah.
in flat Earth, we can believe in whatever we want, and find all sorts of confirmation on the internet.
Oh yeah, there's
Whole Facebook groups dedicated to it.
I love that there's this one ad. I don't remember where I watched it at, where it's this guy who's Google. He's behind this desk, and there's different people that come sit and they're typing something. And oh, I think it's like one of them is vaccines cause autism, I think is what. And he's like, look at all this evidence that says that it doesn't. And then she's like, says the question again, and then he hands her this one sheet of paper. So it's not a good example. I just don't think vaccines cause. It's just the one that I remember happening.
I know
And
there's
they would
definitely
decide the
vaccine
one.
injuries, but especially as long there's definitely such a thing as a vaccine injury. It's
Oh
I've
yeah,
known people that have gotten them, and it's documented with pretty much every vaccine that exists. But generally, they're pretty rare.
yeah,
And I've
and
never had a vaccine injury, so I can't speak on it that much. But I know it exists. But to act like it's an inevitability somehow seems
yeah,
silly and just completely unevidenced.
and I think it was just a joke about how, and that was just that one research paper that came out for autism that everybody jokes about.
Autism. I met some pretty sweet, like really intelligent autistic people because there's they call it the spectrum, and
Mm-hmm.
I've met people that are super high functioning, really smart. So I don't know anything about autism. So
I mean, I don't either, but I also don't think that. To me, that's kind of like a weird notion. Is like you won't protect your kid, but what I see is like autism shouldn't be like this massive thing that you're gonna disown your kid for having if they
yeah,
do end up having
that's pretty
autism.
gnarly. Is
Yeah, I just have never understood that point of view. And it's like, well, if your kid gets autism, I mean, that doesn't, you shouldn't love them less than if they didn't have
that's what they were
autism.
talking about?
Well,
That
no, but
seems
to me,
crazy.
like that's where like my mind goes, and I'm like, it's again people's point of views, personal preferences, personal
Mm.
worldviews that are shaped by your life and how you grow up.
Yeah, it's fascinating what certain things will bring up in our minds and how it's different.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does seem to be based off of our experiences for sure, with or without. And hmm, that definitely is another part of our evolution that's fascinating to me, is how we can see and perceive things differently and then tell a story differently, even if we're standing right next to each other.
Oh yeah, telephone.
Hmm. That's a fun game, by the way.
It is a fun
Yeah.
game. Yeah, it's funny what kind of comes to be when you think that you can hear the same, but yeah, people interpret different.
Mm. That's why
Um,
science, evidence, data, it's why that stuff is so important and so powerful, because it helps us mitigate for our differences in perception.
mhm.
but not completely, not completely, because we're always going to interpret data differently. And so
Hmm.
it's fun. Just a constant dance, science, working with data, working with evidence, but then always also constantly grappling with our interpretation of it, whether it's based off of like a Karl Popper view of things, or maybe this modern take on science, how there's different ways to interpret data and different approaches to gathering data.
Hmm.
There's so much room and so much opportunity for advancing and growing and learning. And science is it's fun. It's so much fun, especially if you take that view that yes, evidence, yes, data, but we can also talk about it
Hmm.
and not be so mm, curmudgeony. Is that a word? I don't think that's a word. Not be such curmudgeons about it and be open to interpretation. Yet at the same time, being comfortable with being, well, we don't know that.
Hmm.
This is just our opinion. What does the evidence show? And that's tough. That's tough. That's tough to really grapple with that, and to put your perception aside and your
Hmm.
feelings aside, and to say, but this is what we do know for sure based off of the evidence.
Hmm.
But it's fun to hypothesize, hypotheticals.
I know hypotheticals. I like
It's more like this
hypotheticals.
hypothetical
Circle. Yeah.
spheroid, spheroids, spheroids with edges. And so before we get too down that rabbit hole, or what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it is important that you do highlight different perspectives coming together and kind of shifting worldviews. And I had mentioned earlier about Taiwan. And
Mm,
to me, Taiwan is a country that has kind of done that a little bit. They have two important subjects right now in what they call institutions or their high schools, and that focuses on quality learning and then implementation of life education. And one thing that they have learned is that they incorporate a lot of different perspectives. And one thing that they have incorporated is Buddhist teachings and the importance of spiritual wisdom. And by learning the importance of spiritual wisdom, it really helps with like promotion, fulfillment, and cherishing of quality life experiences. So like I was talking about being content in like your own personal happiness, which I think back to my high school, that was never something that we talked about. Was am I happy? What
mm.
is my contentment with my life? It
Yeah, especially through a Buddhist perspective, it does come down to
Mhm.
accepting it
Oh
for
yeah.
what it is. And that includes pain.
Hmm. I just think that by having different perspectives into your own life education, I think there is some areas that can really highlight it. Another faith and religious spiritual belief that they have is through Hinduism. And again, that's kind of related to the enlightenment, the cultivation and enlightenment of life wisdom. And it really pushes teachers and also students to seek meaningful understanding of three major topics. Um, so, irrelated components of life education, life wisdom, life practice, and life care. So, wisdom, practice, and care. And I think I would have loved to know that. What is life care? How does that look? And me, I've really tried to focus on my own self care, making sure that I'm in the right state of mind. Because if I'm not, it shows in my beadwork. Whenever I'm not content just sitting there, my lines always look bad. I'm always second guessing every placement. I just wish that life education was taught more as you're growing up and you're kind of learning whole different worldviews. And it's kind of overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, especially how to live a good life.
Hmm.
There's health class and there's other classes that you could take, but a lot of it seems to be just for lack of a better term, useless. There's so much useless information that we're bombarded with during school
Mm-hmm.
that, yeah, I agree. I would have really loved to have learned some of these philosophies from somebody that really knew what they're talking about. Because I learned about Buddhism later in life on my own, and I love that concept of the eightfold path. How there is a certain way to live your life,
Mm-hmm.
and it does not maybe not to happiness, but the end goal is this enlightenment state, and a huge aspect of that is accepting it, letting
Mm-hmm.
go, non-attachment. So yeah, that would be probably that would make dying the hardest, is if you can't let go, you can't detach from your physical life
Mm-hmm.
and let go in that last few breaths, or the last breath. And that is something that used to terrify me, thinking that I wouldn't be able to let go and
Mm-hmm.
somehow maybe get stuck here like a ghost or something. That's still kind of scary, actually, getting stuck here and not being able to move on.
Yeah,
And
that'd be pretty scary.
although I am a scientist and I love data, I love evidence, belief, it's really hard not to believe in things,
Mm-hmm.
especially depending on how you act. And there are people like Sam Harris, for example, who claim that you can have these moral, ethical values absent of belief, absent of some kind of a notion of something greater beyond ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
or some notion of God or spirituality, which I think is total nonsense. I think he's building off the shoulders of all these philosophers that have figured these things out for thousands of years. And now
Mm-hmm.
he just takes them for granted, acting like, oh, you can figure these things out logically. I don't think so. The evidence doesn't show that to me. From what I've seen, nihilists are some of the most miserable, poorly behaved people I've ever met in
Mm-hmm.
my life, because they don't have anything to rely on. It's all just,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's all nothing. Really? That doesn't seem to line up with good behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it is important to behave correctly or in a good way, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found interesting about delving into Taiwan and their life education is that they said, to a certain degree, is that life education has made meaningful contributions to Taiwanese individuals. They show dignity, respect for elders, and reverence for spiritual and religious faiths. So they are seeing that life education does kind of give that little purpose and finding more meaning. And I think what I've realized through all of this practicing of life, meaningful practices, is really trying to find, like, what is your mission? What's your purpose? What
Hmm.
is something that, like, you look forward to every day? I think waking up and being like, I'm alive, it's a new day, be happy you woke up alive. Some people think of it like that. Some people also are like, at any point, jokingly playing around about how they want to die during the day. And I think that's two different ways to think about how death and life plays between yourself and then life education and finding missions. Again, I like little positives throughout my day. If I bead for an hour, I count that as a win. I think we have too much kind of pressure on people to have these really high expectations.
Oh yeah, like
Yep.
an epic life, and the
Yep.
Instagram life. Most
Yeah.
of that's fake anyway, with all the filters and
Mm-hmm.
people, Instagram people. They're Instagram people. I'm on Instagram, but people that are really famous for their Instagram is
Mm-hmm.
what I'm referring to mostly, or any of these social media platforms. Usually, it's a very curated version of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they have down days where they're feeling bummed out. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, they have a hard time in certain aspects of their life. But all you're seeing on Instagram is that very finely painted image of what the surface of their life might look like.
Mhm.
But day to day, they need that same stuff to be able to be grateful for small things.
Mhm.
And for like today, the clouds were really low along the mountains, and it's just so beautiful. And looking at those clouds and then realizing, whoa, I could, what does it look like above the clouds? Huh, I kind of
Mhm.
want to go up there. And just loving the small aspects of your day, realizing that even if it's not epic,
Mhm.
you can make it epic depending on how you perceive it.
Yeah, and I deal with a lot of anxiety throughout my day. A very anxious person, and probably led a lot to my depression as well, being so anxious about things and understanding small victories. But again, understanding what the big and the hardest question, the biggest question is internalizing what is a happy life to you? What is a content life to you? What does that mean? What does that look like? And for me, living 6 hours away from most of my family by myself in a very rich town where people coming and going, I don't see a lot of indigenous people. What does my life look like? And it changes. My idea of happy and content, I think, changes weekly, daily sometimes. But looking inwards has really helped me kind of get past a lot of loneliness that I felt here in Jackson. It's a beautiful, I mean, breathtakingly beautiful. But there are days when I long for those Mission Mountains just to see them. The Tetons are breathtaking, but finding that little happiness and getting outdoors, I will always say that walking, getting outdoors more, like you said, seeing the mountains, seeing the fog is definitely helped me personally get over a lot of anxiety that I've had in my life. I mean, I'm still super anxious, lots of stress, but I have found that little victories in my life and understanding how important my family is, how important my job is, what I'm doing in my job is important, beating my cats, my lizard. Again, it's not a glamorous life. It's just me, myself, and people make fun of me, my cats, but it makes me happy.
Hmm. And that whole glamour, epic, whatever you want to call it, it's not all it's cracked up to be. Being well known is not a good thing necessarily, especially today, where you can get all sorts of crap that you don't really want. And most people aren't even really good at dealing with that kind of stuff.
Mm-mm.
And yeah, fame, fortune, it's really not something that is to be like, we shouldn't really be striving for fame. We should be striving for competence, striving for good social connections that actually have a deep meaning to both people or all people involved.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things that are really going to last a lifetime, and at the end of your life are going to have a lot of meaning. If you have $1 billion in the bank, that ain't going to matter when you're dying, unless you can get robot arms and replace your brain with a robot brain, and then you can live another 1,000 years or something. Maybe it does mean something, but not in a spiritual meaning, not in a spiritual sense where you, if you really are leaving and there's no choice but to die, it doesn't matter how many billions or millions you have, it becomes meaningless. But having people that you really care for around, that does mean something. Having that lifetime that you can think back on and be proud of, that does mean something big time.
Mm.
And being able to enjoy the small things like a good song, that means something. There's a lot of meaning we can find without having to have a million Instagram followers or a bunch of Twitter followers or billions of dollars in the bank. Now, I'm not saying those things are bad in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
but they don't tend to bring those lasting, meaningful things to our life that would actually help at the end of your life. And money's nice, it can help solve problems, but until we come up with some technology to replace our brains and our hearts when they degenerate, as they inevitably do,
Mm-hmm.
it really doesn't mean anything in long terms of this kind, the Buddhist notions we're talking about. Like, and that's not totally Buddhist stuff either, but accepting the way life is instead of fighting against it.
Mm-hmm.
That is really, that helps big time in your day-to-day life, being happy. And happiness isn't an emotion. It really is that, and it's not even being comfortable. In a way, it's being comfortable when you're uncomfortable
Yeah.
and being able to accept your
Mm-hmm.
discomfort and still find that happiness, that content doesn't quite seem to be the right word either. It's one of those, it's a very interesting topic, happiness, and it's kind of separate, but it definitely plays a role here in how we choose to die. And no matter what, in a
Mm-hmm.
way, we're all preparing ourselves to die depending on how we live our lives. And we're like, what is a good life? Asking those kinds of questions of ourselves. Maybe not all the time, but I think it's definitely useful to ask yourself at the end of every day, did I live my best life today?
Mm-hmm.
Did I do better than I did yesterday?
Oh, I came across this article and it was called Five Benefits of Educating Yourself About Death in Your 20s. It's
Hmm.
not you dying in your 20s, it's you in your 20s learning about death. And
Mm-hmm.
the five benefits was, so number one is being prepared can help ease a painful process and move you towards healing. Being a better friend and a more empathetic person. The appreciation for what you have before you experience loss. Building a sense of spirituality to help cope with life's difficulties, and then dealing with fear in a productive way.
Hmm.
And I would have loved kind of just having this as like things to look at. Like we had mentioned, there's so many good online resources that you can look into now. Again, this is just like some blog that I have found very useful, even though I'm 32, I'm past the 20s, but I'm still going to act like I might be in my 20s because some of it's really important. And I have learned after COVID about being a more empathetic person. I have learned a lot about how I don't know what's happening in people's lives. I have been lashed out at. I have cried multiple times because of what people have said. And just knowing that I don't know what's happened to them. What led them to lash out to somebody over something that seems very trivial to you yourself is a very big deal to that person. And I think becoming that better, which I'm a horrible friend, I would need to be better at communicating more. I have certain friends that want to talk a lot more. I have certain friends that we talk once a year. That's enough. I think finding that two-way relationship with friends, but just really being more of an empathetic person in my life, which is sometimes tough in this town, but I try hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And the difference between compassion and empathy, because compassion can be very performative
Yep.
and virtue signally, but empathy, where you actually you're really feeling, or at least trying to feel what this other person is feeling, really putting yourself in their shoes, that's tough. That's really tough,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're pissed off, or you yourself, or you're having a really bad time or bad day. It's tough to be empathetic with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I agree. I think it's really important, even with people you don't like or disagree with. It's a good practice for yourself and to be more at ease and at
Mm-hmm.
peace with yourself.
Yep. And that's kind of the third one, was the appreciation for what you have before you experience the loss. There was this
Mm,
quote from a German philosopher who wrote about how death awareness, the nothing, enables us to shift to a mode where we simply appreciate what things are, the being there, as opposed to worrying about how or what things are. And I think that's so important, is that it shouldn't take the loss of somebody or something to make you appreciate that person. And I have very much experienced that with my parents. I appreciate them a lot more. Not that the fact that they're getting older, my dad is 77, I think. I might have got his age wrong. Sorry, Dad, if I got your age wrong. But it has made me appreciate everything now. Like, we went to Butte for Thanksgiving, where I met them halfway. It was just me and my parents. We had a steak instead of a Thanksgiving dinner. But
mm.
I appreciate that little time that we did have together. When I took him here, when we had like a very expensive birthday dinner for my dad and it was just the two of us, I appreciate things a lot more. But I did experience a lot of loss prior to that, where I wish it's one of those times where I don't really think I regret it, but had I known more about appreciation, more of understanding how important my own life is, I would have had things been a little bit different. Maybe I wouldn't have been as depressive. Maybe I wouldn't have wanted to. I was a cutter for a little bit. Maybe I wouldn't have wanted to do that. I think it would have been opening up about what you're appreciated for. I think is really important. And I try to tell people that a lot, of why am I appreciative to have them in my
Mm.
life.
Yeah, even just small ways. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think those are some of the more important parts of it, is the small things that people don't really notice very often, and being appreciative of that kind of stuff. And yeah, I'm glad to hear you had a good steak instead of turkey for Thanksgiving, because turkey's great and all, but I think a nice fatty steak is better taste wise.
Yeah. I mean, it was way past Thanksgiving. It was the Saturday.
Oh,
So
that's right, because you
yeah.
you came back that weekend.
Yep. Met them there, which was nice because the time I was driving back, I mean, we have so many. Yeah, I mean, probably have a foot of snow at this point.
Hmm.
It has been nothing but snowing since Thanksgiving. So it was nice, but it made me feel really appreciated that my parents were willing to drive 3+ hours to meet me for one night.
Dang. Yeah, and I didn't even know that makes sense now after,
Mhm.
because I was wondering, so you drove there and then drove right back?
I
Which
did.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it's nice. And I made a comment to my mom once about how she makes a lot of comments about how people are beautiful. And I made the comment to her about how I wish that she would call me beautiful more, which seems very petty. It like, in hindsight, it does seem a little petty, but it's how I was feeling at
What,
the
I'm not
moment.
pretty enough for you?
I know. And she calls me beautiful all the time in her own way, but she had never really said that word. And now she says it all the time. And
Hmm.
I think it was opening up to people in that way, where you're exposing some vulnerabilities of your life, is super terrifying. But I think, given you surround yourself with the right people, they take that
Yeah.
knowledge and they very much help you become the person that you want to be. They help you move forward with things. I shared that same information to somebody who instead used that information to kind of rope me into a very toxic relationship.
Hmm.
And going through that also made me appreciate more of this relationships that I have with my family and friends, where sharing that information isn't a tool to get back at me, but it's a tool to help and understand that I do have anxiety, I do have depression, and them helping and guiding you down this path that you are building for yourself. You're creating the path, but they're just helping you along that path.
Yeah, being vulnerable, it has to be the right situation and the right
Mm-hmm.
person, especially for men. I hear this a lot, and I don't agree with it. That I wish men would be more vulnerable. No, you don't. At the end of the day, especially when things get really tough, it's really, really important to have someone to look to that's like a rock that can be there and be strong. And you're not wondering, are they going to lose it?
Mm-hmm.
And I had to learn this the hard way. And especially for kids, kids should not see their parents being vulnerable too much.
Mm-hmm.
They need that stability, and vulnerability is not stable. So I totally agree with you, but you're right. It has to be with the right person in the right
Yeah.
situation.
And I think sometimes you kind of learn. I think that people I was stubborn. So it took myself learning that, but just always knowing that I had that support from my family while I was being the stubborn one and the toxic one as well,
Hmm.
and not leaving the situation. It was knowing that I had the support and knowing that I had people to talk to. And again, like we talked about, is finding people that you can open up to. I know there are some people who aren't in the same situation that I am in. I have a lot of siblings. I have some great parents. I have a lot of close friends that I've known for most of my life, where I'm lucky enough that I could open up to that. But I do think everybody to some capacity should have somebody to open up to, not holding
Yeah.
everything in. When I was younger, I held everything in. I was the hermit of the family. I didn't leave the basement. I was very much sheltered and closed off to a lot of people. And now opening up my world, opening up to people that I find I'm comfortable with is life changing. Is finding that group of people. They don't have to be family. They can be your non-biological family.
Yeah. And for guys, and again, it's one of these weird situations where I see a lot on social media and other places that there's no such thing as being a man or a woman, and that they're not different. It's all societal. Even if it is societal, since when did our culture and social ways become anything but an, an expression of our biology? Either way, there is a difference between men and women, and we should honor those differences because we need each other. And
Mm-hmm.
if we try to dilute those differences, a lot of that power is going to be lost. For guys, we need other dudes that are strong to be able to talk to in times like this when we are having a hard time, because you don't want to be doing that to your kids or in front of your kids or even with your wife, for example. She also needs someone to be strong and stable. Whereas men, we need different things. And not like all men are the same, but there is a role to be played for having someone that's strong and not vulnerable. And it's not something a lot of people like to hear these days. But that's just from my own experience in life and having to learn the hard way that you can't be, at least me, the role I play for my family, I can't be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't. And I don't have any, I don't hold anybody at fault for that. I don't feel bad about that in any way. In a way, it's like a huge honor. It's a great
Mm-hmm.
responsibility that I have to bear the weight on my shoulders. But you're right. There has to be an outlet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just bottle everything up forever because you will lose something in that process. And so that's why it's important to have people in the community to be able to go and to talk to these things about these things with, like, a therapist or a counselor. We're
Mm-hmm.
really good bros that you can go to sometimes and share your soft parts with.
Mm-hmm.
But it is different for men and women. And this is also the way I was raised. It's just different. We have different roles that we play in society, and that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing, and we should embrace those differences, and that some people are way different and some people have both in them. Some people are super masculine and some people are super feminine. To try and water down their identity and that's nested in those ways of being is also tragic, just as tragic as it is to try to water down somebody who's both masculine and feminine, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't see things the same way. So yeah, it's tough the because I've made those mistakes. I speak on that in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that it's one way or another. That's why it's so important to talk about these things and to figure them out for yourself individually. And then to have people that you trust to be able to figure those out with.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, vulnerability, it's a dangerous thing for men because it can get us in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, again, I think vulnerability is challenging and it's very individual, and moving forward. But finding people that you're comfortable talking with, even if
Mm-hmm.
you don't have anybody in your life, the suicide hotline is also always available.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. Because then
Yep.
they're not somebody you're personally connected with, and they can give you
Mm-hmm.
they could give you advice maybe your bestest of friends could never give you.
And I have called it, being someone who was worried about someone who was thinking about committing suicide, and how should I go about that? What do I need to do? What should I do? I having had somebody call me for my dad before they kill themselves has really traumatized me when people say that they're going to kill themselves.
Hmm.
And it's something that has lingered with me for 20 plus years. And how do I deal with that? And so there was a lot of trauma that was brought up when I found out that this person was saying that they were going to kill themselves. And I called that number because I didn't know what else to do. I called my mom. She told me what to do. I called the suicide hotline, and it was intimidating the first time because I didn't know what to say. But they walked me through what I should do. They calmed me down. I was pretty hysterical. Um, Again, looking back, it was a tool, not really a sign that they were going to kill themselves, but it's something that I will always recommend. If you feel like somebody is going to kill themselves, if you are going to kill yourself, reach out to people. There are people who are willing to be there to help set you up, to get you numbers. It's tough. When you're at
Yeah.
that point, when you're thinking about killing yourself, I know it's a tough spot. And
Yeah,
I
that's
know
when
you're
you
probably,
shouldn't bottle anything in. You got to tell
no,
somebody.
you do. And I think we deal with that a lot of in indigenous communities. One of the things that you talked about was involving the community. And one of the check marks that we have on our notes here about moving forward with death in your life is this idea of providing resources and, again, being empathetic to people. There are looking out to support groups, support meetings in your local community. I know some tribes now are building um, community centers for people to do things, go out to the public, see people. Most resources are free and online if you don't feel like you're comfortable talking to somebody. I found all of this information either through podcasts, through movies, through my own life experiences, through research papers, through blog posts, even good old Wikipedia. There is a ton of resources out there. And also, you should encourage people to practice self care. I think we live in a very interesting world right now where, in the job I am, it's 8 to 5. We do 5 hour a day, we do 5 days a week. It's really hard to kind of be in a place that doesn't really encourage self care some days, where practicing that self care, though, is important, and finding those resources And if you need any help finding resources, please feel free to reach out. We do have reach us on any social media. We have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It's all the Indian Science Show. DM us. We will help you get any kind of information or references that you need to help practice your own self-care.
Yeah. And anything we mentioned in this episode is going to be in the show notes as well, including the suicide hotline. And I think we even had a social media post about that a while back.
We did.
And that's a great resource because, like I said, it's not someone you're personally connected with. And so in that way, they can give you advice that your family may not give you or your best friends may not give you. Yet at the same time, like there's a certain point at which you should be vulnerable, especially if you are considering suicide, which is the ultimate way to check out. Like that reminds me of samurai and how they would ritually commit suicide. And that's again, it's very cultural. The way we view suicide or death in any way is going to be very deeply tied to our cultures. And that's important to remember where you come from. And there's a lot of value there and a lot of help. There's a lot of messages that not only will help you through that, but maybe help you avoid it altogether.
I know that we have said a lot this episode, and we've touched a lot of topics. We've touched a lot of deep topics as well.
Yeah.
If there's anything that you would like us to rethink about, if you have anything to add, if there's something we didn't even get to a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, please let us know. We would be more than willing to have a deep episodes on any topic that you feel would be relevant to talk about. I mean, I'm all for self-care and helping people engage with death and life in a very different way.
Yeah, you're talking about Thanatology, right?
Yes,
I really wanted to talk about DMT.
I know.
But yeah, you're right. It's already a lot, and we've gone over an hour and a half at this point. So yes, like Annie's saying, if you have any comments or anything, send us a DM and we'll get back to you. Totally.
Yep. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it's NDN Science Show. Any of those, reach out, DM us. Don't hesitate. We're pretty open-minded about it. I'm very open-minded about it. Even if you want to reach out just to kind of hear our other stories or other topics that we found interesting about this episode, please reach out. We would love to hear from our listeners about this really tough but important topic.
And that's a part of why it's tough, is because it's rarely talked about, and it's got such a negative connotation for modern humans. So yes, if you have any questions, comments, reach out on social media, DM us, but also make sure you go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Let us know what you think. Even one certain sentence helps. It's all useful so that way we know what is working, what people really like to listen to, what people are interested in, and it encourages us to do a better job as well as to keep going with what we're doing.
Yes, and we have, I will say, not so tough conversations happening in the future. We have some really fun episodes, so make sure to keep a lookout. Have your notifications on with your podcast downloads. And we are on most, if not all, streaming podcast platforms.
Yeah, anywhere you listen to us, Spotify. I keep wanting to say iTunes, but it's Apple Podcasts now. So we're all over the place. You can Google us and find us.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure, Annie. I know this is a tough subject, but I'm glad we talked about it. And I'm really glad you brought it up because I had no idea. Even though it's such a huge part of my life and I've dealt with it a lot and made it a topic of conversation in my own family, I had no idea there was a whole field of study based off of Thanatos.
Yes. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Lydia, for agreeing to talk about this conversation.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. Bye, folks.
Bye.